We return home. Then in the morning we set out, intending to hitchhike home. We presumably walked back from Camp Street along Great Close Street and Blackfriars Road till we reached the city centre, just where an old stone-built church stands, seemingly overwhelmed by railway bridges and modern buildings. We started to thumb it from there, turning right into Chapel Street and retracing the route the bus had taken 2 days before. We'd not been thumbing long. We'd walked perhaps a further mile along what is now the main A6 route out of Manchester, and were now in the Crescent, Salford, just before or just past the university, when we got our first lift. A coal lorry stopped and picked us up. The lorry dropped us off in Bolton in Bradshawgate at the traffic lights. Chris got out of the lorry and immediately fell down on the pavement. His leg had gone numb from how he'd been sitting in the cab of the lorry. Perhaps it had been a bit cramped there, with the three of us and the driver squeezed into the cab, and one of Chris's legs had completely gone to sleep. It was a very cold day, he remembers. Our next lift, in a van, took us almost to Chorley, or just beyond Chorley, more likely just beyond, between Chorley and Whittley Woods. I have the impression of a fairly broad road, perhaps one of those with 3 lanes which existed at that time, with 1 lane each way for travelling in and 1 for overtaking, if there was no one overtaking the other way. I also have the impression of there being fields around us, and of our perhaps being in a dale, so that the road rose both before and behind us. It was here that we happened to look back and see a 180 bus, destination Cleveleys, approaching. There was a bus stop some distance ahead of us. Can we reach it in time? We ran, and yes, managed to catch the bus. Although we'd intended hitchhiking all the way back home, this was too tempting to be missed, and we still had enough money for the fares. The 180 used to come into Thornton the back way. Rather than approach Thornton by way of Fleetwood Road, it would travel by what was then the A585 along Skippool Road. Then, instead of continuing on the A585 route along Lambs Road, it would take a detour left into Tarn Road and thence into School Road, before rejoining the A585 at the T-junction of School Road and Station Road. Peter Gooding's caravan home was on the Limebreast farm site, just off School Road. Presumably then we got off the 180 in School Road and called at his place first. Mrs. Gooding, I seem to remember, was quite impassive about the whole matter. She didn't express any anger with us or condemnation. She just outlined for us, quietly and logically, what would have to happen now. Well, of course, you'll have to go and see both your parents, and you'll have to go to the police, and so on. Mr. Gooding's reaction I don't remember. I imagine that they took us in the car to Chris's house and to my house. That makes sense, because I remember their being with us a little later at the police station, but only them. Chris's and my parents were not present. If the 2 of them took the 3 of us in the car, there'd be no room for anybody else. I don't remember what happened at my house, nor whether we went there before or after going to Chris's. We went to Chris's house, and his mum answered the door. We must have gone to the front door then, and knocked. Mrs. Woodhead came to the door, and we went in and sat in the front lounge. She received us well, not at all harshly. Mr. Woodhead must have been out when we arrived. He may have still been at work, or maybe he was just in the backyard or something. It must have been by now getting towards tea time. But when he came in, he sat in the dining room on the other side of the double-glass doors from us. Mrs. Woodhead went in and had a word with him. He presumably reacted negatively, for the first words we could make out were hers, saying, "Don't you want to see him, Cliff?" "I don't know," he barked. That was the kind of reason we called him Fido, and that is our name for him to this day. I next remember our being at the foot of the stairs in the police station, about to go up, and being told by a young constable standing there, "Don't smile," implying that the inspector upstairs would be very cross if we did. We presumably had some sort of silly grin on our faces because of nervousness. We went upstairs and entered the room. The middle-aged inspector sat at his desk there. He invited Mr. and Mrs. Gooding, who were with us, to sit down, and indicated chairs against the wall by the door. Then turning to us, snapped, "But as for you three, you can stand." So we stood there, facing the inspector across his desk, with Mr. and Mrs. Gooding seated to the right of us. "Now, which one of you is Woodhead?" he demanded first. "Are you Woodhead?" "No." "Are you Woodhead?" "No." "Then you are Woodhead," he concluded, looking at Chris. My mum, years later, on hearing me relate this story, commented, "That's detection for you." "Now then, Woodhead, I'm getting sick and tired of you. This is the third time this year that you've run away from home. Do you realise that I could put you away for being in need of care and protection?" When the initial distress of this ordeal had died down and we discussed these things together, we laughed at the inspector's blunder in saying the third time this year. This was clearly inaccurate. It was only the 15th day of the year. What he perhaps should have said was the third time in a year. He then made us turn out our pockets onto the desk. Gooding couldn't. He'd already done so at home, and was quite defiant, or quietly pleased with himself for thwarting the inspector. The latter confronted Chris with the charge that he'd led us others astray in persuading us to run away from home. Again Gooding stood up to him and vigorously denied this. When we tried to explain that we'd gone in order to get Chris cured, the inspector would have none of it. He angrily outlined to us the trouble his men had been to out in all weathers looking for us. Again, afterwards, we were scathing in our comments about him, for on a number of occasions we'd passed policemen who never even blinked at us. After a little while he let us go, maintaining his abrupt and severe attitude to the end. We left with the threat of further action hanging over us. Our case, as far as the inspector was concerned, was unsettled, and he wanted us to return the following day to be interviewed by the CID. He told Chris that he'd not made up his mind what he was going to do with him at that stage. I returned home in great distress because of the harsh treatment I'd received from the police, and because they disbelieved us so completely. In fact, no one seemed to understand. They were not convinced of the reality of what we said we'd experienced. The word "if" kept coming to their lips. "If Chris is cured." "Nobody understands," I said, as I broke down and wept. To me it was crystal clear. There was no room for debate any more. God was real, and he had healed Chris. None of us had any doubt about it. There was no question of having to wait to see if Chris had any more fits. We had come back fully expecting that those we told would be as convinced by our news as we were. Despite the fact that I'd not eaten all day, I couldn't eat the tea that my mum prepared for Peter and me. He ate both his and mine. In fact, I went upstairs to bed because I was so upset. During the course of that afternoon and night, when his anger had had time to cool, Chris's dad had a big change of heart.